Chapter 16. The Adventures of Aeneas. The Aeneid, the greatest of Latin poems, is the chief authority for this story. It was written when Augustus had taken over the bankrupt Roman world after the chaos that followed Caesar's assassination. His strong hand ended the furious civil wars and brought about the Pax Augusta, which lasted for nearly half a century. Virgil and all his generation were fired with enthusiasm for the new order, and the Aeneid was written to exalt the empire, to provide a great national hero and a founder for the race destined to hold the world beneath its rule. Virgil's patriotic purpose is probably responsible for the change from the human Aeneas of the first books to the unhuman prodigy of the last. The poet was finally carried away into the purely fantastic by his determination to create a hero for Rome that would make all other heroes seem insignificant. A tendency to exaggeration was a Roman trait. The Latin names of the gods are, of course, used, and the Latin forms, in the case of any personage who has a Latin as well as a Greek name. Ulysses, for instance, is Latin for Odysseus. Part 1. From Troy to Italy. Aeneas, the son of Venus, was among the most famous of the heroes who fought the Trojan War. On the Trojan side, he was second only to Hector. When the Greeks captured Troy, he was able, with his mother's help, to escape from the city with his father and his little son, and to sail away to a new home. After long wanderings and many trials on land and sea, he reached Italy, where he defeated those who opposed his entering the country, married the daughter of a powerful king, and founded a city. He was always held to be the real founder of Rome, because Romulus and Remus, the actual founders, were born in the city his son built, in Alba Longa. When he set sail from Troy, many Trojans had joined him. All were eager to find somewhere to settle, but no one had any clear idea where that should be. Several times they started to build a city, but they were always driven away by misfortunes or bad omens. At last, Aeneas was told in a dream that the place destined for them was a country far away, to the west, Italy, in those days called Hesperia, the western country. They were then on the island of Crete, and although the promised land was distant by a long voyage over unknown seas, they were thankful for the assurance that they would someday have their own home, and they started at once on the journey. Before they reached their desired haven, however, a long time passed, and much happened, which, if they had known beforehand, might have checked their eagerness. Although the Argonauts had sailed east from Greece, and Aeneas's company were westward bound from Crete, the Trojans came upon the Harpies, just as Jason and his men had done. The Greek heroes had been bolder, however, or else better swordsmen. They were on the point of killing the horrid creatures when Iris intervened, but the Trojans were driven away by them and forced to put out to sea to escape them. At their next landing place, they met, to their amazement, Hector's wife, Andromache. When Troy fell, she had been given to Neoptolemus, sometimes called Pyrrhus, Achilles' son, the man who had killed old Priam at the altar. He soon abandoned her for Hermione, Helen's daughter, but he did not long survive this marriage, and after his death, Andromache married the Trojan prophet Helenus. They were now ruling the country, and of course were rejoiced to welcome Aeneas and his men. They entertained them with the utmost hospitality, and before they bade them farewell, Helenus gave them useful advice about their journey. They must not land on the nearest coast of Italy, the east coast, he told them, because it was full of Greeks. Their destined home was on the west coast, somewhat to the north, but they must by no means take the shortest way and go up between Sicily and Italy. In those waters was that most perilous strait guarded by Scylla and Charybdis, which the Argonauts had succeeded in passing only because Thetis helped them, and where Ulysses had lost 6 of his men. It is not clear how the Argonauts on their way from Asia to Greece got to the west coast of Italy, nor, for that matter, how Ulysses did either, but at any rate, there was no doubt in Helenus's mind exactly where the strait was, and he gave Aeneas careful directions how to avoid those pests to mariners, by making a long circuit southward around Sicily and reaching Italy far to the north of the whirlpool of implacable Charybdis and the black cavern into which Scylla sucked whole ships. When the Trojans had taken leave of their kind hosts and had successfully rounded the eastern tip of Italy, they kept on sailing southwestward, around Sicily, with all confidence in their prophetic guide. Apparently, however, for all his mysterious powers, Helenus was not aware that Sicily, at least the southern part, was now occupied by the Cyclopes, for he did not warn the Trojans against landing there. They reached the island after sunset and made camp on the shore with no hesitation at all. Probably they would all have been captured and eaten if, very early the next morning, before any of the monsters were astir, a poor wretch of a man had not come running to where Aeneas was lying. He threw himself upon his knees, but indeed his obvious misery was enough of an appeal, his pallor like that of one half dead from starvation, his clothes held together only by thorns, his face squalid in the extreme with a thick growth of hair. He was one of Ulysses' sailors, he told them, who had been left behind, unintentionally, in Polyphemus's cave, and had ever since lived in the woods on whatever he could find there, terrified perpetually lest one of the Cyclopes should come upon him. There were 100 of them, he said, all as big and as frightful as Polyphemus. "Fly," he urged them, "up and away with all speed. Break the ropes that hold the boats to the shore." They did as he said, cutting the cables, making breathless haste, all as silently as possible. But they had only launched the ships when the blind giant was seen slowly making his way down to the shore to wash the cavity where his eye had been, which still flowed with blood. He heard the splashing of the oars, and he rushed toward the sound out into the sea. The Trojans, however, had got enough of a start. Before he could reach them, the water had deepened too much even for his towering height. They escaped that peril, but only to meet another as great. While rounding Sicily, they were struck by a storm such as there never was before or since. The waves were so high that their crests licked the stars, and the gulfs between them so deep that the floor of the ocean was disclosed. It was clearly something more than a mere mortal storm, and, in point of fact, Juno was back of it. She hated all Trojans, of course. She never forgot the judgment of Paris, and she had been Troy's bitterest enemy during the war, but she felt an especial hatred for Aeneas. She knew that Rome, which was to be founded by men of Trojan blood, although generations after Aeneas, was destined by the fates to conquer Carthage someday. And Carthage was her pet city, beloved by her beyond all other places on earth. It is not known whether she really thought she could go against the decrees of the fates, which Jupiter himself could not do, but certainly she did her best to drown Aeneas. She went to Aeolus, the king of the winds, who had tried to help Ulysses, and asked him to sink the Trojan ships, promising him, in return, her loveliest nymph for his wife. The stupendous storm was the result. It would undoubtedly have done all that Juno wished if it had not been for Neptune. As Juno's brother, he was quite aware of her way of doing things, and it did not suit him to have her interfere with his sea. He was as cautious, however, in dealing with her as Jupiter always was. He said not a word to her, but contented himself with sending a stern reprimand to Aeolus. Then he calmed the sea, and made it possible for the Trojans to get to land. The north coast of Africa was where they finally beached their ships. They had been blown all the way down there from Sicily. As it happened, The place they came ashore was quite near to Carthage, and Juno began at once to consider how she could turn this arrival to their disadvantage and the advantage of the Carthaginians. Carthage had been founded by a woman, Dido, who was still its ruler, and under whom it was growing into a great and splendid city. She was beautiful and a widow. Aeneas had lost his wife on the night he left Troy. Juno's plan was to have the two fall in love with each other, and so divert Aeneas from Italy and induce him to settle down with Dido. It would have been a good plan if it had not been for Venus. She suspected what was in Juno's mind and was determined to block it. She had her own plan. She was quite willing to have Dido fall in love with Aeneas so that no harm could come to him in Carthage, but she intended to see to it that his feeling for Dido should be no more than an entire willingness to take anything she wanted to give, by no means such as to interfere in the least with his sailing away to Italy whenever that seemed best. At this juncture, she went up to Olympus to talk to Jupiter. She reproached him, and her lovely eyes filled with tears. Her dear son Aeneas was all but ruined, she said, and he, the king of gods and men, had sworn to her that Aeneas should be the ancestor of a race who would someday rule the world. Jupiter laughed and kissed away her tears. He told her that what he had promised would surely come to pass. Aeneas's descendants would be the Romans, to whom the fates had decreed a boundless and endless empire. Venus took her leave greatly comforted. But to make matters still more sure, she turned for help to her son, Cupid. Dido, she thought, could be trusted to make unaided the necessary impression upon Aeneas, but she was not at all certain that Aeneas, by himself, could get Dido to fall in love with him. She was known to be not susceptible. All the kings of the country round about had tried to persuade her to marry them with no success. So Venus summoned Cupid, who promised that he would set Dido's heart on fire with love as soon as she laid eyes on Aeneas. It was a simple matter for Venus to bring about a meeting between the two. The morning after they landed, Aeneas, with his friend the faithful Achates, left his wretched shipwrecked followers to try to find out what part of the world they were in. He spoke cheering words to them before he started. "Comrades, you and I have had long acquaintance with sorrow. Evils still worse we have known. These also will end. Call back courage. Send away gloomy fear. Perhaps someday to remember this trouble, too, will bring pleasure." As the two heroes explored the strange country, Venus, disguised as a huntress, appeared to them. She told them where they were and advised them to go straight to Carthage, whose queen would surely help them. Greatly reassured, they took the path Venus pointed out, protected, although they did not know it, by a thick mist she wrapped around them. So they reached the city without interference and walked unnoticed through the busy streets. Before a great temple, they paused, wondering how they could get to the queen, and there new hope came to them. As they gazed at the splendid building, they saw, marvelously carved upon the walls, the battles around Troy in which they themselves had taken part. They saw the likenesses of their foes and their friends, the sons of Atreus, old Priam stretching out his hand to Achilles, the dead Hector. "I take courage," Aeneas said. "Here, too, there are tears for things, and hearts are touched by the fate of all that is mortal." At that moment, Dido, lovely as Diana herself, approached with a great train of attendants. Forthwith, the mist around Aeneas dissolved, and he stood forth beautiful as Apollo. When he told her who he was, the queen received him with the utmost graciousness and welcomed him and his company to her city. She knew how these desolate, homeless men felt, for she herself had come to Africa with a few friends fleeing from her brother who wanted to murder her. Not ignorant of suffering, I have learned how to help the unfortunate, she said. She gave a splendid banquet for the strangers that night, at which Aeneas told their story, the fall of Troy first, and then their long journeying. He spoke admirably and eloquently, and perhaps Dido would have succumbed to such heroism and such beautiful language, even if there had been no god in the case. But as it was, Cupid was there, and she had no choice. For a time she was happy. Aeneas seemed devoted to her, and she, for her part, lavished everything she had on him. She gave him to understand that her city was his, as well as she herself. He, a poor, shipwrecked man, had equal honor with her. She made the Carthaginians treat him as if he too were their ruler. His companions as well were distinguished by her favor. She could not do enough for them. In all this, she wanted only to give. She asked nothing for herself, except Aeneas's love. On his side, he received what her generosity bestowed with great contentment. He lived at his ease with a beautiful woman and a powerful queen to love him and provide everything for him, and arrange hunting parties for his amusement, and not only permit him but beg him to tell over and over again the tale of his adventures. It is small wonder that the idea of setting sail for an unknown land grew less and less attractive to him. Juno was very well satisfied with the way things were going, but even so, Venus was quite undisturbed. She understood Jupiter better than his wife did. She was sure that he would make Aeneas in the end go to Italy, and that this little interlude with Dido would not be in the least to her son's discredit. She was quite right. Jupiter was very effective when he once roused himself. He dispatched Mercury to Carthage with a stinging message for Aeneas. The god found the hero walking about dressed to admiration, with a superb sword at his side, studded with jasper, and over his shoulders a beautiful cloak of purple inwrought with threads of gold. Both Dido's presents, of course, the latter, indeed, the work of her own hands. Suddenly, this elegant gentleman was startled out of his state of indolent contentment. Stern words sounded in his ear. "How long are you going to waste time here in idle luxury?" a severe voice asked. He turned, and Mercury, visibly the god, stood before him. "The ruler of heaven himself has sent me to you," he said. "He bids you depart, and seek the kingdom which is your destiny." With that, he vanished, as a wreath of mist dissolves into the air, leaving Aeneas awed and excited, indeed, and determined to obey, but chiefly wretchedly conscious how very difficult it was going to be with Dido. He called his men together and ordered them to fit out a fleet and prepare for immediate departure, but to do all secretly. Nevertheless, Dido learned, and she sent for him. She was very gentle with him at first. She could not believe that he really meant to leave her. "Is it from me you would fly?" she asked. "Let these tears plead for me, this hand I gave to you. If I have in any way deserved well of you, if anything of mine was ever sweet to you." He answered that he was not the man to deny that she had done well by him, and that he would never forget her. But she, on her side, must remember that he had not married her, and was free to leave her whenever he chose. Jupiter had ordered him to go, and he must obey. "Cease these complaints," he begged her, "which only trouble us both." Then she told him what she thought, how he had come to her cast away, starving, in need of everything, and how she had given herself and her kingdom to him. But before his complete impassivity, her passion was helpless. In the midst of her burning words, her voice broke. She fled from him and hid herself where no one could see her. The Trojans sailed that same night, very wisely. One word from the queen, and their departure would have been forever impossible. On shipboard, looking back at the walls of Carthage, Aeneas saw them illumined by a great fire. He watched the flames leap up and slowly die down, and he wondered what was the cause. All unknowing, he was looking at the glow of Dido's funeral pyre. When she saw that he was gone, she killed herself. Part 2. The Descent into the Lower World. The journey from Carthage to the west coast of Italy was easy as compared with what had gone before. A great loss, however, was the death of the trusty pilot Palinurus, who was drowned as they neared the end of their perils by sea. Aeneas had been told by the prophet Helenus, as soon as he reached the Italian land, to seek the cave of the Sibyl of Cumae, a woman of deep wisdom who could foretell the future and would advise him what to do. He found her, and she told him she would guide him to the underworld, where he would learn all he needed to know from his father Anchises, who had died just before the great storm. She warned him, however, that it was no light undertaking. "Trojan, Anchises' son, the descent of Avernus is easy. All night long, all day, the doors of dark Hades stand open. But to retrace the path, to come up to the sweet air of heaven, that is labor indeed." Nevertheless, if he was determined, she would go with him. First, he must find in the forest a golden bough growing on a tree, which he must break off and take with him. Only with this in his hand would he be admitted to Hades. He started at once to look for it, accompanied by the ever-faithful Achates. They went almost hopelessly into the great wilderness of trees, where it seemed impossible to find anything. But suddenly they caught sight of 2 doves, the birds of Venus. The men followed, as they flew slowly on, until they were close to Lake Avernus, a dark, foul-smelling sheet of water, where the Sibyl had told Aeneas was the cavern from which the road led down to the underworld. Here the doves soared up to a tree, through whose foliage came a bright yellow gleam. It was the golden bough. Aeneas plucked it joyfully and took it to the Sibyl. Then, together, prophetess and hero started on their journey. Other heroes had taken it before Aeneas, and not found it especially terrifying. The crowding ghosts had, to be sure, finally frightened Ulysses, but Theseus, Hercules, Orpheus, Pollux had apparently encountered no great difficulty on the way. Indeed, the timid Psyche had gone there all alone to get the beauty charm for Venus from Proserpine, and had seen nothing worse than the 3-headed dog Cerberus, who had been easily mollified by a bit of cake. But the Roman hero found horrors piled upon horrors. The way the Sibyl thought it necessary to start was calculated to frighten any but the boldest. At dead of night, in front of the dark cavern on the bank of the somber lake, she slaughtered 4 coal-black bullocks to Hecate, the dread goddess of night. As she placed the sacrificial parts upon a blazing altar, the earth rumbled and quaked beneath their feet, and from afar dogs howled through the darkness. With a cry to Aeneas, "Now will you need all your courage?" she rushed into the cave, and undaunted, he followed her. They found themselves soon on a road wrapped in shadows, which yet permitted them to see frightful forms on either side: pale disease, and avenging care, and hunger that persuades to crime, and so on, a great company of terrors. Death-dealing war was there, and mad discord, with snaky, blood-stained hair, and many another curse to mortals. They passed unmolested through them, and finally reached a place where an old man was rowing a boat over a stretch of water. There they saw a pitiful sight: spirits on the shore, innumerable as the leaves which fall in the forest at the first cold of winter, all stretching out their hands and praying the ferryman to carry them across to the farther bank. But the gloomy old man made his own choice among them. Some he admitted to his skiff, others he pushed away. As Aeneas stared in wonder, the Sibyl told him they had reached the junction of two great rivers of the underworld, the Cocytus, named of lamentation loud, and the Acheron. The ferryman was Charon, and those he would not admit to his boat were the unfortunates who had not been duly buried. They were doomed to wander aimlessly for 100 years, with never a place to rest in. Charon was inclined to refuse Aeneas and his guide when they came down to the boat. He bade them halt, and told them he did not ferry the living, only the dead. At sight of the golden bough, however, he yielded and took them across. The dog Cerberus was there on the other bank to dispute the way, but they followed Psyche's example. The Sibyl, too, had some cake for him, and he gave them no trouble. As they went on, they came to the solemn place in which Minos, Europa's son, the inflexible judge of the dead, was passing the final sentence on the souls before him. They hastened away from that inexorable presence and found themselves in the fields of mourning, where the unhappy lovers dwelt who had been driven by their misery to kill themselves. In that sorrowful but lovely spot, shaded with groves of myrtle, Aeneas caught sight of Dido. He wept as he greeted her. "Was I the cause of your death?" he asked her. "I swear I left you against my will." She neither looked at him nor answered him. A piece of marble could not have seemed less moved. He himself, however, was a good deal shaken, and he continued to shed tears for some time after he lost sight of her. At last they reached a spot where the road divided. From the left branch came horrid sounds, groans and savage blows, and the clanking of chains. Aeneas halted in terror. The Sibyl, however, bade him have no fear, but fasten boldly the golden bough on the wall that faced the crossroads. The regions to the left, she said, were ruled over by stern Rhadamanthus, also a son of Europa, who punished the wicked for their misdeeds. But the road to the right led to the Elysian fields, where Aeneas would find his father. There, when they arrived, everything was delightful. Soft green meadows, lovely groves, a delicious life-giving air, sunlight that glowed softly purple, an abode of peace and blessedness. Here dwelt the great and good dead, heroes, poets, priests, and all who had made men remember them by helping others. Among them, Aeneas soon came upon Anchises, who greeted him with incredulous joy. Father and son alike shed happy tears at this strange meeting between the dead and the living whose love had been strong enough to bring him down to the world of death. They had much, of course, to say to each other. Anchises led Aeneas to Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, of which the souls on their way to live again in the world above must all drink. "A draught of long oblivion," Anchises said. And he showed his son those who were to be their descendants, his own and Aeneas's, now waiting by the river for their time to drink and lose the memory of what in former lives they had done and suffered. A magnificent company they were, the future Romans, the masters of the world. One by one Anchises pointed them out, and he told of the deeds they would do which men would never through all time forget. Finally, he gave his son instructions how he would best establish his home in Italy, and how he could avoid or endure all the hardships that lay before him. Then they took leave of each other, but calmly, knowing that they were parting only for a time. Aeneas and the Sibyl made their way back to the earth, and Aeneas returned to his ships. Next day, the Trojans sailed up the coast of Italy, looking for their promised home.